Miguel's own parents abandoned him in the wilderness when mysterious marks covered his body, terrified he would kill everyone in Millbrook. By the time the Apache healer found him 4 days later, the 7-year-old had stopped believing anyone would come. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sun descended slowly over the small settlement of Millbrook, Arizona, casting long shadows across the dusty streets that separated one modest wooden house from another. The year was 1867, and the frontier town clung to survival like moss to stone, fragile, persistent, and always one harsh winter away from disappearing entirely. In the last house on the eastern edge of town, where the cultivated land gave way to wild brush and rocky terrain, 7-year-old Miguel Torres pressed his small face against the window, watching the world outside with eyes that no longer sparkled with childhood wonder. His fingers traced the glass slowly, leaving smudges that caught the amber light. Behind him, his mother Elena sat at the wooden table, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. His father Carlos stood by the door, his back rigid as a fence post, staring at nothing. The silence in the house was thick, suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the settlement. 3 weeks ago, everything had been different. Miguel had run through the streets with the other children, his laughter ringing clear as bells. He'd helped his father carry water from the well, his thin arms straining with effort, but his face glowing with pride. He'd sat beside his mother in the evenings while she mended clothes, telling her elaborate stories about the adventures he would have when he grew up. 3 weeks ago, he had been loved without question, accepted without doubt. Then the marks appeared. It started with a single red patch on his forearm, raised and angry-looking, like a burn, but without the pain. Elena had dismissed it as a simple rash, treating it with cool compresses and keeping it clean. But within days, more patches emerged, on his neck, across his shoulders, dotting his legs like cruel paint splatters. They didn't hurt, Miguel insisted. They didn't itch or burn or even bother him, but that didn't matter to the people of Millbrook. Mrs. Harriet Fletcher, the blacksmith's wife and the town's most vocal resident, had been the first to see the marks when Miguel played near the well. Her scream had cut through the afternoon air like a knife. "Disease!" she'd shrieked, grabbing her own children and pulling them away. "The boy carries disease!" The words spread faster than wildfire through dry grass. By evening, a crowd had gathered outside the Torres house. Reverend Thomas Whitmore stood at the front, his black coat dusty from the road, his face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He hadn't entered the house. None of them had. They'd simply called out their demands through the door. "The boy must be isolated," the Reverend had declared, his voice carrying the weight of presumed authority. "We cannot risk contamination. We've all heard the stories from the eastern settlements, whole towns wiped out by pestilence." Carlos had tried to reason with them. "He's not sick. He eats, he sleeps, he has no fever." "The marks speak for themselves," Mrs. Fletcher interrupted, her voice shrill with fear. "My grandmother died covered in marks just like those. Scarlet fever, they called it. It took half the village before it finished." "This isn't scarlet fever," Elena had pleaded from behind the door, her voice breaking. "Please, he's just a child." "All the more reason to act swiftly," the Reverend countered. "If you truly love your son, you'll do what's necessary to protect him and this community." Now, standing by the window, Miguel understood what they couldn't say aloud. He'd heard the whispered conversations when his parents thought he was asleep. He'd seen the way his mother's eyes filled with tears every time she looked at him. He'd felt the trembling in his father's hands when Carlos briefly touched his shoulder before pulling away, as if even that small contact carried risk. The town wanted him gone, and his parents, terrified and broken, were beginning to believe they had no choice but to comply. The night air carried a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Elena Torres sat on the edge of Miguel's small bed, watching her son sleep with an expression that mingled love and anguish in equal measure. His breathing was soft and steady, his small chest rising and falling with the peaceful rhythm of childhood. The marks on his skin seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight filtering through the window, red against brown, alien and frightening to eyes that didn't understand. She reached out to touch his forehead, checking for fever, as she had done countless times over the past weeks. His skin was cool and dry, normal, healthy. Yet the evidence of his supposed affliction mocked her maternal instincts, silently declaring that her assessment didn't matter. The town had decided, and the town was louder than any mother's heart. In the main room, Carlos sat across from Reverend Whitmore and Dr. Samuel Harrison, the settlement's only physician. The doctor, a tired-looking man in his 50s with spectacles perched on his nose, had finally agreed to examine Miguel from a distance. He'd stood at the doorway, peering at the boy without touching him, without asking questions beyond the most basic inquiries. "I cannot say with certainty what afflicts the child," Dr. Harrison admitted, his voice low and apologetic. "The marks, they resemble no disease I've encountered in my years of practice. But that, Mr. Torres, is precisely what troubles me. Unknown afflictions often prove the most dangerous." "You're saying you don't know?" Carlos stated flatly, his hands clenched on the table. "You're saying my son might be perfectly fine, but you can't be sure." "In medicine, we often act on caution rather than certainty," the doctor replied. "And given the fear in the community, justified or not, action must be taken." "What kind of action?" Elena's voice came from the doorway. She stood there like a ghost, her nightgown wrinkled, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Reverend Whitmore cleared his throat. "Mrs. Torres, please understand that what we propose with heavy hearts. But the safety of Millbrook must come first. You want us to send him away," she whispered. "You want us to abandon our child." "Not abandon," the Reverend corrected gently. "Isolate, temporarily. There's an old shepherd's cabin 3 miles north, deep in the forest. It's abandoned but sound. The boy could stay there with provisions until—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Until what?" Elena's voice rose. "Until he dies alone? Until his disease miraculously disappears? Or until you all forget about him entirely?" Carlos stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "No, I won't do it. I won't leave my son in the woods like a—" He couldn't say the word. "Like garbage. Like something disposable and unclean, Doctor." Harrison removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a handkerchief as he spoke. "Mr. Torres, I must inform you that the town council met this afternoon. If you refuse to isolate the boy voluntarily, they've authorized his removal by force. You'd be permitted to visit him once a week, bring supplies. Once a week." Eleanor's laugh was bitter and broken. "He's 7 years old. 7. He's afraid of the dark. He can't sleep without his mother's lullaby. And you want to leave him alone in the forest?" "The alternative," Reverend Whitmore said quietly, "is that the entire family will be forced to leave Millbrook permanently, tonight, with nothing but what you can carry." The words hung in the air, like an executioner's blade. Carlos and Elena exchanged a look that contained years of struggle, of building a life from nothing in this harsh land. They'd lost one child already, a daughter, stillborn 3 years ago. This house, this land, this community, however cruel it had become, represented everything they'd fought to achieve. "How long?" Carlos finally asked, his voice barely audible. 2 weeks, the Reverend replied. "If after 2 weeks the boy shows no worsening symptoms and no one else in town falls ill, we'll reconsider his return." Miguel stirred in his bed, calling out softly, "Mama?" Elena turned without a word and went to him, gathering him in her arms with a desperation that made her shake. She buried her face in his dark hair, breathing in the scent of him, soap and sunshine and innocence. How could she explain this to him? How could she tell her beautiful boy that the world had decided he was dangerous? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a sound lonely and mournful, like the cry of something abandoned. By morning, the decision would be made. By morning, Miguel's small world would crumble. And deep in the forest, in a place where no child should ever be left alone, a tragedy would begin. Or perhaps, though none of them knew it yet, something unexpected would unfold. Dawn broke cold and grey over Millbrook, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Miguel sat on the edge of his bed, already dressed in his warmest clothes, a flannel shirt, thick trousers, and the leather boots his father had traded for last winter. He watched his mother pack a canvas sack with provisions: dried meat, hardtack biscuits, a small jar of preserved peaches, a wool blanket. Her hands trembled with each item she placed inside. "Are we going on an adventure, Mama?" Miguel asked, his voice small and hopeful. He'd heard fragments of conversation through the thin walls, understood some but not all. Children always know more than adults think, but they also cling to hope longer. Eleanor couldn't speak. She simply nodded, pressing her lips together to keep from sobbing. An adventure. Yes, that's what they would call it. Carlos appeared in the doorway, his face haggard from a sleepless night. He carried a small hatchet, a length of rope, and a tin box of matches, tools for survival, tools for abandonment. "It's time," he said quietly. They left through the back door, avoiding the main street where curious eyes might watch. The path leading north from Millbrook was barely more than a deer trail, winding through scrub brush and rocky outcroppings before disappearing into the dense forest that marked the edge of civilization. Carlos walked ahead, the sack of provisions over his shoulder. Elena held Miguel's hand so tightly it almost hurt. The boy looked back once at the only home he'd ever known, his young mind trying to memorize every detail. The forest swallowed them quickly. Tall pines rose like cathedral columns, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the morning light. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, the call of unfamiliar birds, the rustle of unseen animals, the creak of branches moving in the wind. Miguel had never been this deep into the woods. His parents had always warned him about the dangers: mountain lions, bears, getting lost. Now they were leading him directly into everything he'd been taught to fear. "Papa, how long will we stay?" Miguel asked after they'd been walking for over an hour. His legs were tired, but he didn't complain. He'd learned early that complaints brought only worry to his parents' faces. "Just a little while," Carlos answered without turning around. "Just until everyone at home feels better." "But I feel fine," Miguel protested. "The marks don't hurt." Elena's grip tightened on his hand. She had no answer for that. The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from the forest like something from a dark fairy tale. It was small, barely large enough for 2 rooms, with weathered wooden walls and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were intact but covered in grime, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Someone had lived here once, had built a life here. Now it stood empty and forgotten. Inside, the air was musty and cold. A simple stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough wooden table and a single chair occupied the center of the room. A cot with a thin mattress sat in the corner. It was shelter, yes, but it was also a prison. Carlos immediately set to work, his movements mechanical and purposeful. He swept out the debris with a makeshift broom, checked the chimney for blockages, arranged the provisions on the table. Elena unfolded the wool blanket and spread it on the cot, her hands smoothing out every wrinkle with obsessive care. Miguel stood in the doorway, understanding beginning to dawn in his dark eyes. "You're leaving me here," he said. It wasn't a question. Elena broke then, sinking to her knees and pulling him into her arms. "Only for a little while, mi amor. Only until the town understands you're not sick. We'll come back. I promise we'll come back." "When?" His voice was steady, but tears had begun to slip down his cheeks. "Soon," Carlos lied, crouching beside them. He placed both hands on his son's small shoulders. "You're brave, Miguel. Braver than any man in Millbrook. Can you be brave a little longer?" The boy nodded, because what else could he do? He was 7 years old, and the two people he trusted most in the world were telling him this was necessary. Carlos showed him how to start a fire, how to ration the food, how to keep the door barred at night. Elena sang him one last lullaby, her voice breaking on every word. Then, as the afternoon light began to fade, they stood to leave. "Wait!" Miguel ran to his mother, pressing something small into her hand. It was a smooth stone he'd carried in his pocket, shaped like a heart. "So you remember me?" Elena clutched the stone, unable to speak. Carlos took her arm, physically supporting her as they walked to the door. They looked back once, just once, at the small figure standing alone in that cabin, trying so hard to be brave. Then they stepped into the forest and walked away, leaving their son behind. The first night was the worst. Miguel sat on the cot, wrapped in the wool blanket, watching the fire his father had built slowly die down to embers. Every sound outside the cabin made him flinch, the snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl that might have been wind or might have been something alive and hungry. He'd never experienced darkness like this, so complete it felt solid, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. He didn't sleep. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, heard her broken voice promising to return soon. Soon. What did soon mean when you were 7 years old and terrified? A day? A week? Forever? When dawn finally crept through the grimy windows, Miguel felt dizzy with exhaustion. His stomach growled, but he was too nauseous to eat. The marks on his skin had spread during the night, new patches appearing on his chest, behind his ears, across his face. They still didn't hurt, but they itched now, a maddening sensation that made him want to scratch until he bled. He ventured outside on the second day, driven by thirst. A small stream ran about 50 yards from the cabin, its water clear and cold. Miguel knelt beside it, cupping the water in his hands and drinking deeply. It tasted of earth and minerals. Strange, but not unpleasant. He splashed some on his face, hoping it might soothe the itching marks. It didn't. On his way back to the cabin, he discovered wild berries growing on thorny bushes. They were small and dark, and he had no idea if they were safe to eat. But the provisions his parents had left were already running low. He'd eaten too much the first day, seeking comfort in food, when comfort was nowhere else to be found. He picked a handful of berries, examining them carefully. They looked similar to the ones his mother sometimes bought at the trading post. He ate 3, then waited. His father had once told him that was the smart thing to do with unknown plants. Eat a little, wait, see what happens. Hours passed. He felt no worse, so he ate more. By evening, his stomach cramped painfully, and he spent half the night vomiting outside the cabin door. The third day, Miguel could barely move. The combination of bad berries, poor sleep, and stress had weakened him considerably. The marks had continued to spread, now covering most of his exposed skin. When he looked at his reflection in the stream, he barely recognized himself. His face was swollen, the marks raised and angry-looking. His eyes, normally bright and curious, had become dull with fever and despair. He tried to start a fire that evening but couldn't manage it. His hands shook too much and the matches kept slipping from his fingers. 3 precious matches wasted before he gave up, curling into a ball on the cot and shivering under the single blanket. "Mama," he whispered into the darkness, "please come back. Please." But no one came. On the fourth morning, Miguel woke to rain. It pattered against the roof, leaked through cracks, pooled on the floor. He was too weak to move, too tired to care. The provisions were nearly gone, just a few pieces of hardtack he couldn't bring himself to eat. His throat was so swollen he could barely swallow water. He thought about dying, not in the way adults think about it, with fear and regret, but in the simple, matter-of-fact way of children. If he died here, would his parents ever know? Would anyone find him, or would he just disappear, becoming one of those stories people whispered about around fires? The marks had begun to weep now, clear fluid seeping from the edges. It didn't hurt, but it frightened him. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe he really was sick. Maybe he really was dangerous. Through the rain, he heard something. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the forest toward the cabin. Miguel's heart raced. His father, his mother, or something else, one of the wild animals he'd been warned about. He tried to stand but couldn't. His legs wouldn't support him, so he simply waited, lying on the cot, staring at the door with eyes that had almost given up hope. The footsteps stopped outside. A shadow fell across the window. Then, slowly, the door began to open. Miguel opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. His voice had left him, along with his strength, his hope, and nearly his will to live. All he could do was watch as a figure stepped into the cabin, tall, wrapped in animal skins, with long dark hair and a face marked by weather and time. The man wasn't from Millbrook. Miguel had never seen anyone like him before, but in his fevered, weakened state, the boy understood one thing with crystal clarity. This stranger was either his salvation or his end. And perhaps, after 4 days alone in the forest, Miguel no longer cared which it would be. Nietzsche had been tracking a deer for 2 days when he heard the child's cry. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the sound of rain drumming against leaves, but his ears had been trained since childhood to distinguish human sounds from animal ones. He'd abandoned his hunt immediately, following the sound to its source with the fluid efficiency of someone who moved through forests the way others moved through their own homes. The cabin surprised him. He knew these woods well, had traveled through them for years, but he'd never noticed this structure before. It sat tucked into a hollow, deliberately hidden, as if whoever built it had wanted to remain invisible. The door hung slightly open, rainwater streaming off its edge. When he stepped inside, the smell hit him first, sickness and sweat, the sour tang of vomit, the musty odor of unwashed bedding. His eyes adjusted quickly to the dim interior, finding the small figure on the cot. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, covered in red marks that stood out starkly against brown skin. The boy stared at him with eyes that held too much suffering for someone so young. Nietzsche approached slowly, making his movements deliberately calm. He'd learned long ago that frightened creatures, human or animal, required patience. He knelt beside the cot, studying the child's condition with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades learning the ways of healing from his grandmother, one of the most respected medicine women among his people. The marks were everywhere. Face, neck, arms, visible beneath the boy's torn shirt across his chest and stomach. They were raised, weeping clear fluid, some clustering together while others stood alone like islands. Nietzsche's first thought was measles, but the pattern was wrong. His second was smallpox, which made his heart clench with fear, but again the presentation didn't match. He reached out carefully, touching one of the marks on the boy's forearm. The child flinched but didn't pull away, too weak to resist. The mark was hot, inflamed, but not in the way of infection. Nietzsche pressed gently around it, watching the skin blanch and return to red. He lifted the boy's hand, examining the spaces between his fingers, checking his scalp, looking at his eyes. Then he understood. Not disease. he murmured in his own language, though the boy couldn't understand the words. He switched to Spanish, which he'd learned from traders. No enfermo, no sick. Miguel blinked slowly, trying to process the words through his fever-addled mind. Nietzsche stood and moved to the door, scanning the forest floor. The rain had softened the earth, making tracks visible. He followed them a short distance, finding what he sought, a patch of plants with distinctive three-lobed leaves, their surfaces glossy even in the rain, poison oak, and there, crushed beneath a rock near the cabin's foundation, more of the same plant. The boy had been in contact with poison oak, likely multiple times. Perhaps he'd used the leaves to wipe his hands or laid on them while exploring. Maybe he'd burned some as kindling, breathing in the toxic oils. The reaction was severe, one of the worst Nietzsche had seen. But it wasn't disease. It wasn't contagious. It was simply a child's body responding to an allergen. He returned to the cabin, his mind already working through treatment options. The boy needed fluids first. He was clearly dehydrated. Then cooling compresses to reduce the inflammation. Later, a paste made from jewelweed if he could find any growing nearby, mixed with clay from the stream bed to draw out the oils still lingering in the skin. But most importantly, the boy needed to not be alone. Whatever had brought him to this abandoned cabin, whoever had left him here, had condemned him to suffer needlessly. Nietzsche had seen this before, communities driven by fear, making decisions that harmed the innocent. His own people had suffered such judgments from settlers. He would not leave this child to the same fate. He gathered the boy in his arms, surprised by how light he was. Miguel made a small sound of protest, but Nietzsche shushed him gently, wrapping him in the wool blanket. "I help," he said in broken Spanish. "Take to camp. Make better." Miguel's eyes widened. He tried to speak, to protest, to ask questions, but only a wheeze emerged from his swollen throat. "Safe," Nietzsche promised, though he knew the boy had no reason to trust that word. Trust had already failed him once. But Nietzsche had not traveled these mountains for 43 years without learning that sometimes trust must be rebuilt one action at a time. He stepped into the rain, the child secure in his arms, and began the long walk to his people's temporary camp. Behind him, the cabin stood empty once more, a monument to fear and ignorance. Ahead lay something different. Knowledge, healing, and perhaps redemption. The Apache camp emerged from the forest like a secret, nestled in a protected valley where 3 streams converged. Circular dwellings made of brush and canvas formed a loose circle around a central fire pit. Smoke rose from several structures, carrying the scent of cooking meat and herbs. Children's voices rang out in play, momentarily silenced when Nietzsche appeared, carrying his unexpected burden. The people gathered quickly, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes sharp as flint approached first. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing at Miguel. Nietzsche responded in kind, his tone firm but respectful. The exchange lasted several minutes, during which Miguel felt multiple pairs of eyes examining him, judging him, deciding his fate. Finally, the woman nodded once and gestured toward a dwelling slightly removed from the others. Nietzsche carried Miguel inside, laying him gently on a pile of furs that smelled of sage and cedar. The shelter was warm, protected from the rain, with a small fire pit in the center that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The old woman, her name was Desba, Miguel would learn later, knelt beside him. Her weathered hands moved over his body with surprising gentleness, examining the marks without touching them directly. She spoke to Nietzsche, who nodded and left quickly. Desba remained, her presence somehow both intimidating and comforting. She began to undress Miguel, removing his wet clothes with efficient movements. He was too weak to feel embarrassed, too exhausted to protest. She wrapped him in soft deerskin, then covered him with blankets woven from wool and plant fibers. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in days, Miguel stopped shivering. Naiche returned with his arms full. He carried several clay pots, bundles of fresh plants, and a leather pouch filled with what looked like crushed minerals. Desbar took them from him, and together they began to work. First came the washing. Using water heated over the fire and cloths made from soft leather, they cleaned Miguel's skin with painstaking care. The water was mixed with something that made it slightly slippery and smelled of mint. Each mark was washed individually. The cloth pressed gently against the inflamed skin and lifted away. The process took nearly an hour, and by the end, Miguel felt lighter somehow, as if more than dirt had been removed. Next, Desbar prepared a paste using the materials Naiche had brought. She ground plants between two stones, mixing them with clay and a clear, viscous substance from one of the pots. The paste was cool and grey-green, and when she began to spread it over Miguel's marks, the relief was instantaneous. The burning, itching sensation that had plagued him for days began to fade, replaced by a soothing coolness that made him want to cry with gratitude. Naiche held a cup to Miguel's lips. The liquid inside was warm and tasted bitter, but he drank it obediently. Almost immediately, his eyelids grew heavy. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Desbar's face, stern but not unkind, watching over him like a guardian spirit. He slept for 18 hours straight. When he finally woke, weak sunlight was filtering through the dwelling's entrance. His throat no longer felt swollen shut. His body, while still aching, no longer burned with fever. And most miraculously, the itching had stopped. Naiche sat nearby, working on what looked like a new bowstring. He noticed Miguel's movement immediately and set his work aside. "You wake," he said in Spanish. "Good. You drink." He helped Miguel sit up, supporting him when his arms proved too weak to do it alone. The water was cool and flavored with something sweet, honey perhaps, or some plant extract. Miguel drank deeply, feeling strength begin to seep back into his body. "The marks," Miguel managed to whisper, his voice still hoarse. Naiche gestured to Miguel's arms. The boy looked down and gasped. The marks were still there, but they'd changed dramatically. No longer angry and weeping, they'd flattened and faded to a dull pink. Some of the smaller ones had disappeared entirely. 3 days more, Naiche said, holding up 3 fingers. "All gone." "You not sick, never sick, just plant hurt you. We fix." Miguel's eyes filled with tears, not of pain but of relief so profound it felt like a physical force. "Not sick," he repeated, needing to hear it again. "Not sick," Naiche confirmed. He reached out and placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, a gesture of reassurance that transcended language. "You safe now." Outside, the camp continued its daily rhythms. Children laughed, women sang while working, men discussed the day's plans. And inside the healing lodge, a small boy from Millbrook began to understand that perhaps the world was larger and kinder than he'd been taught to believe. By the end of the first week, Miguel could walk without assistance. The marks had faded to barely visible patches that Desbar assured him would disappear completely within another few days. But something more remarkable than physical healing was taking place. Miguel was discovering what it meant to belong. The Apache children had been wary at first, watching the strange boy with the marked skin from a distance. But children possess a capacity for acceptance that adults often lose. On Miguel's 3rd day of consciousness, a girl around his age approached with a bowl of stew. She didn't speak Spanish, and he didn't speak Apache, but she smiled and sat beside him, and that was enough. Her name was Kaya, and she became his first friend in the camp. She taught him words in Apache through elaborate gestures and drawings in the dirt. "Shah," she said, pointing at the sun. "Tu," touching water. "Idilohi," indicating food. Miguel repeated each word carefully, delighting in Kaya's laughter when his pronunciation was particularly terrible. Other children followed her lead. Soon, Miguel found himself included in their games, running through the camp in wild chases that left him breathless and laughing. They played a game with a small ball made of sewn leather, tossing it in elaborate patterns that required quick reflexes and cooperation. Miguel was terrible at it, but no one seemed to mind. They simply adjusted their throws, gave him easier catches, celebrated when he succeeded. Naiche watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen too many children damaged by isolation, their spirits broken by rejection. But this boy, Miguel, he'd learned the name, was resilient. Given kindness, he bloomed like a desert flower after rain. In the evenings, Miguel would sit near the central fire, listening to the adults talk, even though he understood little. Desba began teaching him alongside Kaya, showing him how to identify useful plants, which roots could calm a fever, which leaves helped wounds heal. She spoke slowly, mixing in Spanish words she'd learned from traders, and Miguel absorbed everything with the intensity of someone who discovered learning could be a joy rather than a burden. One afternoon, Naiche took him to the stream. They waded into the shallows, and the healer showed him how to catch small fish with his bare hands. "Patient," Naiche instructed, holding his hands just below the water's surface. "Very still. Fish forget you there." Miguel tried, failed, tried again. On his 7th attempt, he felt the tickle of fins against his palm and closed his hands reflexively. He caught nothing but water, but Naiche nodded approvingly. "Good try. Tomorrow you catch." As they walked back to camp, Miguel worked up the courage to ask a question that had been weighing on him. "Why did you help me? You didn't know me." Naiche was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "My grandmother say, we help because we can, not because we must, not because we gain. We help because that is what makes us human." He paused, then added, "Also I see boy before, sick with same marks. His people afraid, like your people. They leave him alone. He die, not from marks, from fear and loneliness. I not let that happen again." Miguel absorbed this in silence. The revelation that his condition wasn't unique, that another child had suffered and died from the same ignorance that had driven him into the forest, filled him with a strange mixture of sadness and gratitude. That night, as he lay on his furs, listening to the camp settle into sleep, Miguel thought about his parents. Did they wonder if he was still alive? Did they regret leaving him? Part of him, a small, wounded part, hoped they suffered for their choice. But mostly he just missed them. Missed his mother's lullabies, his father's quiet strength, the familiar sounds of home. But this place, with its strange rhythms and unfamiliar language, was becoming home too. And that realization brought with it a complicated tangle of emotions he didn't have words for in any language. Kaya appeared in the doorway of his shelter, carrying a small bundle. She smiled shyly and handed it to him. Inside was a necklace made of smooth stones, threaded on a leather cord. She pointed to herself, then to him, then clasped her hands together. "Friends, Ida ahi," she said softly. "Friend, Ida ahi," Miguel repeated, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to hide. She squeezed his hand once and disappeared into the night, leaving him holding a gift more precious than she could know. Proof that he was wanted, that he mattered, that he belonged. 3 weeks after leaving their son in the forest, Elena and Carlos Torres made their weekly journey to the cabin. Elena carried fresh provisions, new blankets, and a small wooden horse Carlos had carved during sleepless nights. Her hands trembled as they approached, rehearsing in her mind all the things she wanted to tell Miguel, the promises she'd make, the love she'd try to prove existed despite their terrible choice. The cabin was empty. Elena's scream shattered the forest silence. The provisions they'd left were scattered, some spoiled, some eaten by animals. The blanket lay in a heap on the cot. But Miguel was gone. No note, no sign, nothing to indicate what had happened to their son. Carlos searched frantically, calling Miguel's name until his voice went hoarse. They found tracks leading away from the cabin, a man's footprints, large and deliberate, and signs that something had been carried. Elena collapsed beside the cold fire pit, her mind conjuring every possible horror. They returned to Millbrook in a state of shock, their grief turning immediately to rage. Carlos stormed into Reverend Whitmore's home, grabbed the man by his collar, and demanded answers. "You said he'd be safe. You said 2 weeks and we could bring him home. Mr. Torres, please." The Reverend sputtered, but Carlos wasn't finished. "Our son is gone. Taken by something or someone, and it's your fault. This whole town's fault." Dr. Harrison, summoned by the commotion, arrived with news that turned everything on its head. He'd been corresponding with a colleague in Santa Fe, describing Miguel's condition. The response had come that very morning. "It wasn't a disease," Dr. Harrison said quietly, holding the letter with trembling hands. "My colleague has seen this before. It's a reaction to poison oak. Severe, yes, but not contagious. Not dangerous to others. Your son was never sick. He was never a threat." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Elena made a sound that was neither scream nor sob, but something between them. Carlos sank to his knees, the full weight of what they'd done crushing him. "We have to find him," Elena said, her voice suddenly steely with determination. "Now, today." They gathered a search party, men from Millbrook who now carried their own guilt like stones in their pockets. They followed the tracks from the cabin, moving deeper into territory they'd been warned to avoid. Apache territory. The Apache scouts spotted them long before they reached the camp. Naiche, alerted to the approaching group, positioned himself at the camp's entrance with several other men. He recognized the desperation in their movements, the way they called a name into the wind, Miguel. When the two groups faced each other, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Carlos stepped forward, his hands open and empty. "We're looking for our son," he said in Spanish, hoping someone would understand. 7 years old, brown hair, marks on his skin. "The marked boy is here," Naiche replied in the same language. "He heals. He is safe." "We need to see him," Elena pleaded, stepping beside her husband. "Please, we made a terrible mistake." You thought fear was stronger than love," Naiche interrupted, his voice hard but not cruel. "You thought others' judgment mattered more than your child's life." The words struck like physical blows because they were true. Elena's legs buckled, but Carlos caught her. "You're right," Carlos admitted, his voice breaking. "You're absolutely right. But he's still our son. Please." Naiche studied them for a long moment. Then he turned and called out in Apache. Miguel appeared from one of the dwellings, Kaya beside him. He looked different. Healthier, yes, with the marks nearly gone, but also changed in ways that had nothing to do with his skin. He stood straighter, smiled more easily. He wore Apache clothing and had a stone necklace around his neck. Elena gasped. "Miguel!" The boy froze when he saw his parents. A complicated storm of emotions crossed his face: joy, anger, confusion, hurt. He took a step forward, then stopped, looking back at Kaya, at Naiche, at the camp that had become his refuge. "Mama?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Papa?" Elena ran to him, dropping to her knees and pulling him into her arms. She sobbed into his hair, words tumbling out in a desperate stream. I'm so sorry, mi amor. We were wrong, so wrong. Please forgive us." Miguel stood stiff in her embrace. When he finally spoke, his words were in Apache first, then Spanish. "You left me." "I know," Carlos said, joining them, wrapping his arms around them both. "We failed you. We let fear make us cowards. But we're here now. We know the truth. You were never sick. You never should have been sent away." "They knew," Miguel said, pulling back to look at his parents. "Naiche and Desba, they knew right away. They helped me. His voice broke. "They didn't leave." The conversation that followed wasn't easy. Miguel sat between his parents and Naich, with Desba translating the harder concepts and Kaya holding his hand for support. The adults talked for hours while the sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows that stretched and merged. "We want you to come home," Elena said, her voice raw from crying. "The whole town knows now." Dr. Harrison explained everything. They understand they were wrong. "Understanding isn't the same as changing," Miguel replied, his words carrying a wisdom beyond his years. The Apache had taught him to think before speaking, to consider weight and meaning. "They'll still look at me different. They'll still remember." "You're right," Carlos admitted, and the honesty in his voice surprised his son. "They will remember, and they should. What happened to you, what we did, shouldn't be forgotten. But people can learn. We're learning." Naicha had remained quiet, but now he spoke. "The boy belongs to himself. Not to your town, not to my people. He must choose where his feet want to walk. Can't I walk in both places?" Miguel asked, looking between the faces of those who now claimed him. "I miss home. I miss my bed, the smell of Mama's cooking, Papa's stories. But I love it here too. Kaya is my friend. Desba teaches me things. I know words now that don't exist in Spanish." Elena and Carlos exchanged glances. "What are you saying?" Elena asked softly. "I want to go home," Miguel said carefully. "But not forever, and not alone." He looked at Naiche. "Could you come, just for a little while, to teach them what you taught me?" The request hung in the air, audacious and impossible. An Apache healer visiting Millbrook? A town that had only months ago considered all natives as threats. It was unthinkable, but Naiche found himself considering it anyway. "Why?" he asked the boy directly. "Because they need to learn," Miguel said with the straightforward logic of childhood. "They were scared because they didn't know. You could teach them about plants, about healing, about—" He gestured helplessly, "about not being afraid of things that are different." Desba spoke in Apache, her tone sharp but not unkind. Naiche responded, and a debate began among the adults present. Miguel didn't understand all the words, but he understood the tension. What he was asking was dangerous. Towns like Millbrook had histories with the Apache that ran deep and bloody. Trust was hard-earned and easily shattered. Finally, Naiche turned back to Miguel. "I will come. But only if your town agrees, only if they show respect." Carlos stood immediately. "I'll make sure of it. I'll talk to the reverend, the doctor, everyone. We owe you our son's life. The least we can do is listen." That evening, as preparations began for the journey to Millbrook, Kaya found Miguel sitting alone near the stream. She sat beside him in companionable silence before speaking in halting Spanish. "You come back, visit?" "Yes," Miguel promised. "I'll learn better Apache. I'll come back and teach you more Spanish. He struggled to explain the concept forming in his mind. "We'll be the bridge." Kaya didn't understand the word bridge, so Miguel drew in the dirt. Two shores separated by water and a structure connecting them. He pointed to himself, then to her. "Us. We connect." She smiled, understanding dawning in her eyes. She took his hand and squeezed it. "Idahi," she said firmly. "Friend." "Idahi," he repeated. That night, the camp held a small ceremony. Desba painted symbols on Miguel's forehead with clay, marks of healing, of protection, of belonging. She gave him a small pouch filled with herbs and taught him the words to say when using them. "You are medicine boy now," she said seriously. "You carry knowledge. Use it well." Miguel felt the weight of the responsibility and the honor simultaneously. He wore the stone necklace Kaya had made, carried the wooden horse his father had carved, and held in his heart the understanding that he was forever changed. He would return to Millbrook, but he would not return as the same frightened boy who'd been left in the forest. He was something new now, something neither his birth town nor the Apache camp had seen before. He was proof that fear could be overcome, that learning could bridge divides, and that sometimes the greatest healing happened not in bodies, but in hearts. The day Miguel Torres returned to Millbrook, the entire town gathered in the square. Word had spread that he was alive, that he was healed, and that he was bringing with him the Apache healer who had saved his life. Some came out of curiosity, others from guilt, and a few, very few, from genuine desire to learn. Naiche rode into town beside the Torres family, his posture alert but not defensive. He wore his traditional clothing with dignity, his medicine pouch visible at his side. The townspeople stared, whispered, but Carlos had done his work well. No one raised a weapon. No one shouted threats. Reverend Whitmore stepped forward first, and to everyone's surprise, he removed his hat and bowed his head. "We wronged you," he said simply, looking at Miguel. "We wronged your family. And we nearly committed a far greater sin through our ignorance." He turned to Naiche. "You are welcome here. Whatever we can learn from you, we are ready to receive." Dr. Harrison approached next, medical bag in hand. Would you be willing to show me the treatments you used? The plants, the methods?" Naiche nodded slowly. Over the following days, something remarkable happened in Millbrook. The Apache healer set up near the edge of town, creating a teaching space where anyone could come to learn. Dr. Harrison was his first student, frantically taking notes as Naiche identified plants growing right under their noses that had medicinal properties they'd never known. The women came next, curious about the salves and poultices. Naiche showed them jewelweed growing by the stream, explained how it neutralized the oils of poison oak and ivy. He demonstrated the proper way to prepare willow bark for pain, how to make poultices that drew infection from wounds, which herbs calmed fevers, and which induced sleep. Miguel became the translator, his Spanish and growing Apache vocabulary making him invaluable. But more than that, he became the living proof of what fear could destroy and what compassion could build. When children asked about his marks, now faded to barely visible traces, he told them the truth about being afraid, about being alone, about finding help in the last place he'd expected. Mrs. Fletcher, who had first raised the alarm about Miguel's disease, approached him one afternoon. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I was scared, and I let that fear hurt you. I have no right to ask, but could you forgive me?" Miguel looked at her for a long moment. He thought about everything he'd learned, from Desba's patience, from Naiche's wisdom, from Kaya's friendship. "I'm still scared sometimes too," he admitted, "but Naiche taught me that being scared is okay. It's what you do with the fear that matters." 3 weeks after Naiche arrived, Kaya came to visit with Desba and several other members of their band. The sight of Apache walking peacefully through Millbrook would have been unthinkable months before. Now, children from both communities played together while adults exchanged knowledge about farming, hunting, and healing. On Naiche's last evening in Millbrook, the town held a gathering. There were no speeches, no grand pronouncements. Just food shared, stories told, and the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted. Fear hadn't disappeared. It never does completely. But it had been challenged, diminished, transformed into something closer to understanding. Miguel sat between his two worlds, his mother on one side and Kaya on the other. His father and Naiche talked nearby, their conversation flowing more easily now through a combination of Spanish, Apache, and gesture. The marks on his skin were nearly invisible now, but the mark he'd made on his community would last far longer. Years later, when Miguel had grown into a man who spoke 3 languages and practiced medicine, learned from 2 cultures, people would still talk about that summer. about the boy who was abandoned and the healer who saw a child rather than a disease, about the town that learned to question its fears, about the bridge that was built not of wood or stone, but of courage, compassion, and the simple choice to help rather than harm. Some lessons, Miguel would tell his own children someday, can only be learned through suffering. But the greatest lessons are learned when we choose to suffer together, to heal together, and to build something new from the ashes of our mistakes.